Welcome back to this edition of Talk to Al Jazeera, in which we are talking to Mr. John Holmes, the United Nations Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the UN Emergency Relief Coordinator. In the first part, we particularly focused on Darfur. In this second part, we will look at Darfur and other crises from a global perspective. Darfur was described as the biggest human disaster on earth by some Western countries. We know that Darfur is just one of the big crises that you are dealing with around the world. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka now, and the Congo. What is the comparison there?
Well, as I say, we don't like to make league tables of crises, but the single biggest operation is Darfur. The second biggest operation, very close to that, is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where fighting has been going on in the east for a long time. We have major problems in Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, as you mentioned, and of course the occupied Palestinian territory, we shouldn't forget, where there are very serious humanitarian problems. So about 70% of humanitarian aid altogether goes to these kind of conflict areas, complex emergencies we sometimes call them, and the rest is for the natural disasters which happen from time to time in different parts of the world. The whole thing is probably worth around $12 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money, but of course compared to the average financial bailout, it's a very small amount of money. We need more resources to deal with all these problems, and we hope that somehow the world will be able to find them in the future.
We know that the crisis in the Congo has taken a longer time, more IDPs, more victims. Why is Darfur treated as the biggest crisis and not the Congo?
Well, it's a very good question, and I cannot answer it. You have to ask your colleagues in the media why they give so much focus to Darfur.
You made Darfur the biggest humanitarian operation.
No, I didn't make it. It simply is the biggest humanitarian operation in the world because that's where the biggest need has been. It costs more money and helps more people than any other single conflict. As you say, DRC is more long-running, is wider in geographical area, but in terms of actual dollars and the amount of aid that's being given, it's rather less. We try to make sure that we are not following where the media go, we are not following what governments want to worry about, we're following where the need is. And that's our only agenda. Our agenda is not political, it's purely based on need, whoever the people in need may be, whatever religion they have, whatever ethnic basis they have, whatever their political beliefs, we follow need. And that's why these relationships are established, not because we're worrying more about Darfur for other political reasons.
I just want to understand, our viewers want to understand, who decided to make Darfur the biggest humanitarian operation? Is it yourselves, or is it governments who gave donations, or is it a media construct?
Well, I think in terms of humanitarian need, whether it's what built it up as a political crisis and the most important crisis in the world, which it isn't, but some people have presented it as from time to time, that's governments and the way they want to behave. That's not my issue. My issue is the people in need, and we're responding to need, and the needs in Darfur are great because the displacement was so great. That's an objective fact of life. That's why we deal with it, not for any other reason.
Do you think we can separate politics in Darfur and in other areas from pure humanitarian relief?
Well, we have to. I mean, that is our job. Our whole basis of what we do is that this is independent, impartial humanitarian relief, which has got nothing to do with politics, and there's no hidden political agenda. Of course, people suspect us from time to time of having hidden political agendas or doing it for other reasons. I promise you, for the UN agencies and the NGOs which are there, the humanitarian side is all that concerns them. And we try to make sure that we are meeting needs equally around the world and not focusing on issues for particular political reasons.
We know that the Palestinian problem is perhaps the longest refugee problem and displacement problem in the world. How much of a success did you have recently with the crisis in Gaza after the war?
Well, I think the situation is still extremely worrying. I think the aid we've been able to give through different organisations and NGOs that work there is sufficient perhaps to keep people alive. What we would like to do is to be able to contribute to the reconstruction of Gaza, to the rehabilitation of Gaza, and to give people in Gaza a normal level of human dignity and human life. Unfortunately, because the crossing points are still effectively closed for all but small amounts of goods, we can't do that. And we have appealed, and we continue to appeal very strongly to Israel to open those crossing points, not to use the people of Gaza as a political bargaining chip, just to open the crossing points and let goods in, not only humanitarian goods, but commercial goods, so that people can start to lead normal lives. But I'm afraid for the moment that plea is not being heard, and people's political focus is elsewhere. I think that's very regrettable.
Do you think Western countries have a share of responsibility in this because they're not putting enough pressure on Israel to open the crossing points?
Well, I think, you can always argue that, and I think the overall need, which everybody recognises, is to move towards a proper political settlement of the whole problem, which is not just about Gaza, it's about the West Bank, it's about the two-state solution. Unfortunately, we simply haven't made enough progress in recent years. In some ways, we may even have gone backwards because settlements have continued in the West Bank. That's what we need to address. We need to find ways urgently forward. But my plea is, don't regard the people of Gaza as a bargaining chip in this deal. Let's let them live, and while the political discussions continue.
In Sri Lanka now, what's the situation for you, and how much help could you channel to those victims?
Well, the situation is extremely worrying, particularly for the people who are still trapped in this very small area where the fighting is still going on. The LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, are refusing to allow the civilian population who are with them to leave, and therefore they're very vulnerable to the fighting that's still going on. That is our biggest concern, to somehow get that civilian population out of that area. About 200,000 people have escaped from the fighting and are now living in camps south of that area in Sri Lanka, and we are working very hard with the government of Sri Lanka to give as much aid as we can to them as quickly as we can to make sure they have the basic conditions of life. That's what we're doing at the moment.
In Pakistan now, it sounds like the pace of the crisis is very surprising, perhaps to many. How about you? Did you expect what's happening now in Pakistan, and did you put on place the necessary structures and facilities?
We didn't expect the scale of it, and we didn't expect it to develop so quickly. I mean, we have been aware for some months now of the scale of displacement from parts of northwest Pakistan because of the fighting between the Taliban and the authorities. And so we already had, before the latest crisis, about 500,000 displaced people registered. We have just increased our own office in Pakistan. Other people have been doing the same because they've been able to see this coming. But then this latest fighting in Swat and the possibly up to 500,000 more people coming out, that of course has taken us a little bit by surprise, and so we're scrambling to keep up and to respond.
How do you make the world respond to a certain crisis like the one in Sri Lanka or in Pakistan, and what's the mechanism there?
Well, we use the media because that's a very important way of communicating with people. But we talk to governments directly about what's needed. We talk to the donor countries about what's needed. We talk to the agencies and the NGOs about what's needed. They have their own offices on the ground so they can see for themselves. And we try to respond, as I say, purely to the needs we see. We don't always succeed perfectly, but I think the humanitarian enterprise, if I can call it that, is much better organised and coordinated than it was a few years ago. And I think it's much fairer than it was between crises than it was a few years ago. So that's how we try to do it, and we communicate with everybody as much as we can, and that's one of my particular jobs, is doing that communication, is drawing people's attention to humanitarian needs and mobilizing the resources, the money that we need.
Humanitarian organizations are accused of benefiting by these crises. They mediatize them, they get more funds, and it's like a vicious cycle of crises and money, and it goes like this. What is your take on that?
I think I hear that accusation a lot. Honestly, I think it's nonsense. Of course, humanitarian organizations want money, but they only want money because they want to go and help in these situations. I mean, the accusation that people are living well in Darfur because of the aid operations, and they want them to continue in some way so they can go on benefiting, honestly doesn't add up. If you're an aid worker living in Darfur, it's very difficult, it's very dangerous. You don't do it for fun, you don't do it for money, you do it because you're genuinely committed to do it. That's what humanitarian workers are doing, and I think the accusation that somehow they're just in it for their own profit is unworthy, frankly.
But why is it always the case that whenever there is a report from a humanitarian organization, it is just basically 2 points? The situation is bigger, the situation is grave, and we don't have enough facilities.
Well, that's often because the situations we're talking about are like that. I mean, what I would say is that there has been and can be on the part of some organizations at some of the time a temptation to exaggerate in order to raise money. We're very, very careful not to encourage that, and I'm very, very careful to present the situation as objectively as I can, and to make sure that we're not minimizing problems, and governments sometimes want to minimize problems, but we're not exaggerating problems either. We need to find the right objective numbers. And one of the good things in in the last few months in Darfur is that we worked together with the government to produce a joint assessment of the needs, which revealed that there were indeed some serious problems.
Thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.